This video is brought to you by Sayorite. Visit Sayorite.com for all your project supplies, tools, and instructions. In this video, we'll be walking you through the steps required to make forward berth cabin cushions, or V-berth cushions for a powerboat. As you can see, this type of cushion has a lot of curved or straight sides, which also includes wedges on some sides. The wedges are required to fit up against the sides of a boat that include varying angles. It looks complicated, but watch closely as this video details the easiest and quickest way to make your own forward berth cabin cushions. One way to simplify the construction of any cushion is to install the zipper on the underside, what we call the bottom plate, rather than on the side of the cushion's boxing. Another helpful approach when cushions have curves or many odd turns, as is often found in forward berths, is to use seam stick basting tape, a double-sided tape which helps assure the corners and turns will match up before the sewing takes place. We'll show you those helpful tips later on in this video. Let's get started. The old cushions are desperately in need of replacement. You can drastically change the look of your cabin, home, or RV by making irregular cushions yourself. We'll show you how. Cindy with Sayorite will now show you the easiest way to make these cushions. Here's Cindy.
We're ready to do this interior cushions on Brian's boat, and we're going to make some changes to make these cushions fit a little bit better. Up in this area, there's probably at least the width of my finger gap between the cushion and the boat. So we're going to fill that in when we make our new patterns. This corner is empty. We're going to try and make that better.
Cindy will lay Durascrim pattern material down to make a pattern for the new cushions. These are general guidelines for making cushions with a zipper on the bottom plate. They are not solid rules, but rather are preferred recommended practices that typically result in what we believe are the best looking finished cushions. Feel free to pause the video here to study the list of 11 steps. It is what we will be using to make the cushion in this video step by step. The old cushions have been removed and Durascrim pattern material laid down.
I'm going to use a ruler up against this angle so I get a good fit around this edge and make sure that everything's as flattened out as possible.
The edge she is scribing against is where the horizontal base transitions to the curved hull or wall.
Okay, I have my line drawn all the way around the perimeter of this, so we're going to take it out of here and cut along the marked line and then bring it back in to mark this bottom edge and make sure that the size is good before we go any farther.
We're not going to take this out of the boat. We're just going to use our scissors and cut along that line that she scribed on the Durascrim pattern material.
Okay, we've cut the pattern on the lines that I drew to begin with, and it looks like it fits really well. So we're going to mark these edges down here, and then I'm going to go back around and mark our top layer.
In a boat, these types of areas are called a V-berth. They typically consist of multiple cushions that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes it's just two separate cushions that fit side by side, or it can be up to 4 or more separate cushions. These separate cushions make it possible to remove cushions easily, for instance to gain access to storage compartments underneath them. For our area, we will separate this pattern into 4 separate cushions as seen in this rough drawing. Here, the pattern material is not laying flat due to this obstacle. A slit will allow the pattern material to lay flat. And now that the bottom edge has been traced around, she can cut out that portion with scissors as well. Often, a cushion called a keystone is used to make more real estate for either standing or sleeping, as it can be removed as a separate cushion.
Okay, before I mark the other outside edge, I'm going to mark the keystone, and I'm going to lay my ruler kind of in the middle between the wood and the carpet right here.
This wooden base for the keystone can be
Draw
removed.
a line around there.
At this time, we've cut everything out on this pattern material. However, we will not cut out the keystone cushion or the port or starboard side cushions or the bow cushion. We're just going to make marks for those. Here.
Now you can see what's going to happen with this cushion if we leave it like this. We're going to have 2 sharp angles right here. So instead of working with 2 sharp angles, we're going to make that just a little bit easier on ourselves and angle it out. So we still have two angles, but they're not sharp angles. And I'm going to trim that off right there.
Always label your pattern material. This is the keystone, and POUT stands for port side out, and SOUT stands for starboard out.
To make the separation in this cushion and these two cushions, I'm going to use the top of this board to draw my line across here with the yardstick.
A full materials list and the tools that we use can be found at the end of this video.
Okay, now I want to draw the line here to separate these two cushions. So I'm going to find the center of this area. So mica mark at 9 3/4. Measuring from here to here, it's 39, 19 and a half.
That's the center of that area.
So if I connect my two lines there, I have my cushions divided for this area.
We're going to leave the pattern material in place. We now need to determine the wedge or the curve along the sides of the cushion to match the hull or sides of the boat.
So to determine the angle for cutting the foam, we're going to use a 4-inch box, and I'm going to put it right along my cut edge and draw a line out here, and then take the yardstick and measure into this edge, and in this area it's 5 inches, so I'm going to write down 5 inches right there, and then move over about a foot and do it again. I'm just going to do that all the way around, and that'll determine the wedge for our foam piece, the angles. And right here it's 5.5. It's going to change all the way around.
The box or object that you use needs to be the same thickness as the foam that you'll be using. These measurements that Cindy is marking on the DuraScrim pattern material will be used to determine the wedge or the angle of the edge when it comes time to cut the foam and make the cushion's plate. Using this pattern, next up, we'll pattern the foam.
We're ready to cut apart these pieces for the V-berth cushions. I'm just going to cut on the lines that we drew with a marker, and that'll make our patterns for the foam and for our fabric.
Sailrite recommends two types of foam for boat cabins, dry fast foam or high density polyurethane foam. Both foams have advantages and a few disadvantages. For more information about foam, click the link at the top right corner or contact us via email or phone. We're glad to help you pick the right foam for your application.
We're ready to get our foam ready to cut for these two larger pieces. And I've got them laid on the foam. We have a little bit of extra patterning here, so we're going to add this piece on. But I want to make sure that this distance is enough to add the 5 inches that I need here and another 5 inches here. So I have them laid about 11 inches apart, so that will work. And before I mark anything, I want to glue this piece on.
If your foam is not large enough in size, a common practice is to glue sections of foam together to make it the required size. We used a 3M General Trim adhesive for this project. It worked very well. But we also sell a less expensive spray glue that works just as well for gluing foam, called Foam Lock Spray Adhesive. Spray both surfaces thoroughly and allow the solvents to dry for a few minutes before bonding.
Okay, we want to let this sit until it gets tacky. So if you just touch it, you can tell whether it's wet or tacky, and this is getting tacky. So I'm just going to flip this piece over and snug it right up against the bigger piece.
We'll move on to patterning, but we should allow that bond to sit for a few hours before we try cutting the foam.
I'm ready to mark my the distance around the foam that's bigger than this cushion, and to make sure that this stays in place, I'm going to just give myself a couple of reference marks so I don't move it while I'm in the process of making all of these added dimensions. Here I need a 1/4 inch extra, this edge and this edge. This edge is also a 1/4 inch. It's this edge out here that I need to add the 1/4 inch plus my measurements that I made when we were on the boat.
Visit Sayorite.com and search for Fabric Calculator to find a very helpful calculator that helps determine how much fabric is required for your project. However, for a very detailed calculator which even helps to calculate the exacting size of your cut panels and much more, go to the App Store and purchase the Box Cushion Fabrication Pro app. Cindy's using the clear acrylic ruler here to measure 1/4 inch away from all sides of the foam, except for where the wedge is. There, or here I should say, at 3 inches, she measures over 3 1/4 inch. Here, at 3 1/4, she measures over 3 1/2 inches and places a mark. She'll do that at each one of the locations where she placed marks on the Durascrim pattern material, using that clear acrylic ruler all across the location where the wedge needs to be included. Here, there is no wedge, so she measures over 1/4 inch from the pattern material and strikes a line. Now it seems like we should just be able to move the pattern material over and line it up to those marks we made, but we can't. So here Cindy is trying to find the center location by splitting the difference between the two measurements and then marking there, so her marks are a little closer, so she can go from mark to mark. Why can't we just move the pattern material over? Because the hull or sides of the boat up of the wedge were different from the base where the pattern material was laid. So try to find the intermediate point by splitting up the difference, and then we'll strike a line connecting all of those dots together. Notice as she strikes from one dot to the next, the line is not nicely curved or gradually curved, but rather has some rather jagged edges. But that's the way the boat was made, and as you'll see at the end, the cushion will fit perfectly in that opening.
Before I remove the patterns and cut the foam, I want to mark these with P up, because this is the top of this one,
This is the port side cushion.
and S down, because this is actually the bottom of this cushion.
And this is the starboard cushion, which we did not show patterning. Cutting foam is relatively easy. We're going to use a professional foam cutter here.
The secret to get this knife to cut into the foam when you get started is start the blade before you actually put it up against the foam.
Visit Sayorite.com to see a variety of professional foam cutters that may fit your budget. However, you can also cut foam with an electric kitchen knife. We will not show that in this video, but we do have separate videos showing using an electric kitchen knife to cut foam.
Okay, this is the bottom side of this cushion. So on this side, I need to mark 1/4 of an inch away from my original black line, and then we're going to cut this area off, and that will be the wedge to go up against the side of the boat.
How do we know this is the bottom side? Well, if you look at the pattern material, the Durascrim pattern material, you can see that the markings are actually reading upside down. There, you can see it better here. Okay, how do you cut the wedge? We like to line up the edge of the foam along the table. Obviously a sacrificial table, not your favorite kitchen table where damage may occur. Then tilt the foam cutter or electric kitchen knife so that the bottom of the blade runs along the edge of the table, and the top part of the blade is guided along the line struck down on the foam. A second helper is highly recommended. That helper can help keep the foam lined up on the table's edge as typically the bottom portion of the foam is not cut perfectly straight. It has some included curve, and it will need to be repositioned as the foam is cut, as you can see in the video. Nicely done.
Now this is the top side of this piece, so we want to turn this over because we want the bottom to be the smaller side and the larger area to be on the top.
The one we just cut the wedge out of was the starboard side. This is the port side of the boat. Notice the pattern material reads upside down, so this is the bottom side.
So I'll be adding 1/4 inch to this edge.
Same procedure as what was done on the starboard cushion. Coming up next, we will cut the boxing to size. These cushions have wedges. We need to pattern the boxing. That is not typically required for rectangular cushions, but it is for irregular cushions like this.
Okay, we're going to make the pattern for the boxing strips, and because of this kind of extreme wedge in the side of this cushion, and it changes all the way down, you can see that it's much deeper here than it is here. I'm going to use the Durascrim patterning material and make an exact pattern of the foam.
At this point, there's no seam allowance added to the boxing. She's only replicating exactly what the side of the foam is on the Durascrim pattern material. Later on, a seam allowance will be added to this. Not only are the two long sides important, but the two short edges are important to trace around as well.
Okay, and before I remove this, I'm going to mark that this is the top and this is the bottom, and I'm going to label this the bow and also put right side.
What about sides that are not perfectly rectangular? Those two need to be patterned because you need to match the curve on the end. Sides that are rectangular, we don't have to pattern like this. Only sides that include a wedge or have a curved edge or end. Be sure to label the pattern material so you do not get confused. Now, next up, we're going to do a rectangular area, and there we need to only take measurements.
And this edge here doesn't have any of the wedge in it from here all the way around to here. So I'm going to measure this piece of boxing as all one piece, and I may have to seam it, but I can adjust the seam and put it wherever I want to away from the corners.
Using a soft tape measure like this, you can easily measure around to gain the appropriate length that you need for this boxing. Since this is all a rectangular shaped boxing, we do not have to pattern it.
So it needs to be 56 5/8.
This side includes an angled end due to the wedge, so we need to pattern it. Now we'll add some seam allowance.
Okay, we want to add a little bit of seam allowance to all of these pieces, and technically we should add 1/4 inch to each side of this, top and bottom, or top and bottom. But it's not really going to make that much difference in the end product, so I'm going to add the 1/2 inch to the bottom of all of these pieces.
Adding seam allowance on one long side of a rectangular shaped boxing is acceptable. However, what Cindy is doing for the irregular shaped boxing is a shortcut and may have a very slight consequence when it comes time to join the boxing to the plate. What should be done for irregular boxing is to split the total seam allowance desired and add it to both long edges.
I got this line down here a little bit wobbly, so I'm drawing a new line from here to here where the correct line is, so ignore this one. Now I'm going to add the 1/2 inch.
I know. Those of you paying attention just heard that we are only adding a 1/2 inch to the boxing width. But earlier, we said we were going to sew the cushion up using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That means the boxing will be smaller in width than the thickness of our foam, as we will use up a full inch for seam allowance. This is a correct and intended action. We want the boxing to be slightly smaller in width than the foam for a good fit and a cushion cover that typically does not wrinkle up much after heavy use. So, get that doubt out of your head. Here you can see all of the patterned boxing pieces, and they do match the sides perfectly except for the 1/2 inch seam allowance that we added.
For these 3 sides, this side here, and this here, that was the measurement that I took, and we're just going to cut our 4.5 inch width by the correct length for these 3 edges. Okay, we need to make a pattern for the top plate of this cushion. We currently have a pattern for the bottom plate, but it's too small, and we want to be able to see the pattern on the fabric when we put this on. So we're going to use the Durascrim because we can see through it.
When the foam was originally cut to size, we already made it 1/4 inch larger on all sides. So, since we are using that foam as a template for the top plate, we do not need to add the 1/4 inch to all sides. Simply trace around the foam onto the Durascrim pattern material.
Okay, now I want to label this before I go too far with it. So I'm going to label it port side up. This will be the right side of my fabric, and this will be the side of the fabric that's against the foam when the cushion is made.
We'll cut out the Durascrim pattern material with scissors. We did not show patterning the bow cushion in this video. That will be a separate video. But since we centered the fabric's pattern on that bow cushion, we want to make sure the pattern on the port and starboard cushion is uniform. So we'll use the bow cushion to do that.
Okay. Now to figure out where I want to put this next piece, I'm going to put my first piece right on top of the pattern so that all my designs are in the same place. And we have to move this off center from the 54 inches because this piece is too wide to lay it on this center pattern. So we moved over to the next pattern, and we have allowed for 1/2 inch seams here, so I'm going to put a pin 1/2 inch from the edge, and then I'm going to fold that back and put another pin in that spot. Take this pin out and put another pin 1/2 inch above that pin, and this pin right here will become my cutting line. So my pattern will start.
The fabric that we've chosen is called Giabella, great for indoor and outdoor applications.
At this top pin, I'll put the top edge of my pattern at the top pin, and I'll need to move over 1/2 inch from the center of my pattern so that I allow for a 1/2 inch seam here so that when this is sewn, it lands right on the center of that. So I'm going to put a few pins in this again and draw around it with the grease pencil.
The Durascrim pattern material is pinned down to the decorative fabric in several spots, so we can easily trace around the pattern material or use scissors and cut out the decorative fabric. We're going to be using a hot knife, which helps to seal the edge. Using a hot knife or scissors is a choice. A little bit later on, we'll show you the consequences of not using a hot knife. They aren't drastic, but there are a few consequences, mainly ravelly edges.
Okay, I'm going to use the same procedure to match this side to this side. I've got the piece I just cut laid on top of the pattern.
The starboard cushion's top plate is cut out. Next, we're working on the port side.
I'm going to put a pin right here. I know that's where I want to start this edge of my piece. And then I can take this off and move the edge of the pattern over 1/2 inch from the center of the pattern on my fabric.
We'll follow that same procedure that we just did for the starboard side cushion's top plate for this port side.
And then when there's a 1/2 inch seam taking out of these two pieces, it should match very close like that.
We will not show tracing and cutting this port side top plate out. Let's move on to the boxing.
These are the boxing pieces that we cut for the cushion that we're working on. And these are never going to show. They'll be up against the side of the boat. So I'm not going to try to match these to anything. I'm just going to use my fabric off to the sides of the pieces that I already cut. And these I'm going to cut with scissors. You can use scissors or the hot knife, either one will work. The hot knife keeps it from raveling, is kind of the advantage to the hot knife, but scissors work just as well.
When we cut out the top plates, we pinned the material down, traced around it, and used a hot knife. However, you could do it like this if you use scissors. But if you do, here are the consequences of an edge that's cut with scissors rather than a hot knife. You can see it unravels easily. In comparison, here's an edge cut with a hot knife. No unraveling. These are the irregular boxing pieces, and they're cut to size to the pattern material. Remember, the 1/2 inch for seam allowance has already been added to the width. We also had some rectangular shaped boxing along the one side of our cushion. Here she's using the clear acrylic ruler to measure it to 4.5 inches, and then she'll cut that out as well. At this time, she will not cut the straight piece to the exact length.
Are you sure? Yep.
Okay, we have the top plate of this cushion, and we want this area right here to match because there's a possibility that it will show. So to match this one, I'm going to lay it on the right on top of the pattern so that it's identical underneath, and put a pin in again at 1/2 inch. Lift that up and put a pin under here at that same pin line, and then I can take this off, and this 1/2 inch from here will be my cutting line. And on this one, I want these two corners to match.
This is the only irregular portion of the boxing that may show up when the keystone is removed. So here she's trying to match up the pattern to the plate.
So this is where I'll cut this piece so that it matches across the front of this cushion.
After this has been cut out, we have all of the boxing cut to the appropriate size for our cushion. But this rectangular piece is a little bit on the long side, and that's okay. We have not cut it to length yet. We'll do that when we start sewing it together.
Because I have several of these cushions to cut out, I'm going to attach these pieces to the top plate so they don't get them confused with the next cushion, and pin them in place where they will eventually be sewn.
The processes for the starboard and port cushion are the same, so we will only show sewing the assembly of one, not both, in this video. None of the boxing that we made accommodates for a zipper. Up next, we'll be patterning the bottom plate, and that bottom plate will have the zipper.
This bottom plate will be cut out of the cushion underlining fabric, and I want to lay my piece with the top down. So I have this piece turned upside down, and I'm going to add 1/4 inch all the way around for seam allowance, and cut this with the scissors.
The cushion underlining material, or Pfeiffer-Tex if you choose to use that, does not need to be cut with a hot knife. They do not unravel.
Before I take this pattern piece off, I want to mark this port wrong side, so I make sure I don't get my pieces mixed up.
Now that the bottom plate is cut out, we can attach it to the assembly of the top plate and the boxing that we pinned together, so we won't get confused when we move on to the next cushion. We are not going to show the next cushion, which is similar to this one. We're going to move on and show how to make piping for your cushion. This is an optional step that we've chose to use.
We're ready to cut the bias cording for our cushion. We're going to put bias cording around the top plate of the cushion, and to find the bias line in the fabric, I'm going to line my ruler up on the selvage of the fabric and fold the selvage up to the ruler, and this will be my bias line. And then I can use the rotary cutter and the mat. And I need my cording to be 1.5 inches wide to get a 1/2 inch seam. That will vary depending on the thickness of your fabric.
We mentioned earlier that we were going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew this cushion together. So we want the flange or tail of the piping to be a 1/2 inch when it is sewn together. Cindy has determined that with the piping choice and the fabric selection, she needs to cut this bias piping to 1.5 inch so that the tail will equal 1/2 inch.
It works better to cut this on the bias because it has a little bit of give and it goes around the corners better. It doesn't have to be cut on the bias, but it does go around your cushion a little bit nicer if it is. And I'm folding this up just so it still fits on the mat and I can cut it all in one piece without moving anything around.
She'll cut several strips, hopefully enough to go around the entire perimeter of our cushion. Then later on we'll sew them together. To sew the multiple strips together, first the outside surfaces should both be facing up. Then Cindy will explain exactly what she'll do to join these two strips together and the others.
When I sew these pieces together, I also need a bias cut here where the two pieces go together. So I can also use the ruler to get that cut and put my 45-degree line here and cut the ends off of these. And then I'm going to flip the top one and put them right sides together and leave a little ear on each side. And where I'm going to stitch is right at this, from angle to angle, right across there.
When joining sections of piping together, typically we don't worry about what the pattern looks like.
And I'll do that with all of them before I go to the machine.
We'll be using the world's best portable walking foot sewing machine, the Saorite Ultrafeed sewing machine.
I'm going to make the stitch a little smaller on this just because this is such a short seam. It has a tendency to pull out and I'm not going to back stitch at each end. So I'm going to go ahead and make my stitch kind of small for these short seams.
To sew this Giabella fabric, we're using a V69 polyester thread. This is a Derby Navy. Saorite sells many colors of polyester thread. Check them out at Saorite.com. We're also using a size number 18 needle. A size number 16 needle will work just as well with V69 thread. This Giabella fabric, available from Saorite, sews easily with a home sewing machine. Other fabrics are also available that are great for V-berth cushions.
Now to make the cording, lay your piping in the center of your fabric piece and just roll it over. And the foot has a channel in it that will carry the piping through as it stitches. So I'm just going to roll my fabric over and try to keep these two edges as even as possible because this will be my 1/2 inch seam. And I can use a longer stitch length for this. I'm going to hold the piping in the center of my fabric and just guide it as it goes. Fold my fabric over and try to keep these two edges even because this will create my 1/2 inch seam. And the foot has a channel cut in it that's going to guide the piping through it. So if I hold it back here and just keep everything in place, the foot's going to pull it through for me.
The Saorite Ultrafeed sewing machines have a cording tunnel built into the standard foot. If you use another type or brand of sewing machine, you may need to install a cording foot.
And then when I come to a seam, I want to fold that open so that it doesn't have so much bulk. And the reason that I want to cut these seams on the bias is because when it folds over, then it doesn't fold over on top of itself and it's not quite as thick in those areas.
We picked Saorite's medium 5/32 inch welting cord. It's a polypropylene material with a uniform thickness which is very soft and takes bends very well. If it gets wet, it will not soak up water. Since we've opted to use piping, we're going to sew the piping to the top plate. First, Cindy will find the plate that she needs and remove the boxing that was pinned to it.
I'm ready to apply the piping or the cording to the top plate of the cushion. This is the top of the cushion and this is the outside edge of the cushion. So I want to start my piping out here on this outside edge so it doesn't land anywhere in the area where the cushion is actually going to be used. This will be at the outside edge by the sidewall of the boat. So I'm going to start right here and go all the way around. I'm not going to pin it on. I'm going to just sew it. And I'm not going to cut this off of my larger piece just in case this piece isn't big enough. And if it is big enough, then I can add on to it for my next piece. And I want to start a couple of inches from the end so I can finish this off when I get back around to there. I'll need to clip it at the corners so it'll go around the corners better.
Making clips in the tail or flange of the piping at the corners or bends will help the piping take the curve or bend well. Notice that when she reaches the corner, she goes a little too far, so she lifts the foot and backs the assembly up. Then she'll bury her needle with the foot lifted, make the turn, lower the foot, and continues to sew.
And when I cut my top plate, I allowed for a 1/2 inch seam. In this area right here of my cording is a 1/2 inch. So if I lay this edge of the cording along this edge of my plate, I'll have my 1/2 inch seam without measuring.
The Saorite Ultrafeed sewing machine is a heavy-duty portable walking foot sewing machine. It is perfect for upholstery applications like this and does a great job sewing canvas, vinyl, and much more. This is a Saorite Ultrafeed LS1. It is a straight stitch machine, but Saorite also sells a straight stitch and zigzag version called the Saorite Ultrafeed LSZ-1. If you don't own an Ultrafeed sewing machine yet, check them out at www.saorite.com today. Let's take a look at one more turn. Here it's already been clipped. She finds the corner, buries the needle where she wants to turn, lifts the presser foot, rolls the assembly around, lowers the presser foot, and then continues down the other side, making the 90-degree turn. What about inside turns?
On this inside corner, I'm going to make a clip into the corner. There's already a little cut there from the hot knife, but I want to clip it in about 3/8 to 1/2 inch. And then this corner will kind of turn into a straight line. And it makes it real easy to go around that corner if you clip it like that.
Nicely done. Now let's come to the point where we need to join the piping ends together. Here Cindy will explain it.
Now to get back to where I started, I'm going to cut my this cording off a couple of inches beyond where I started. And then open up the stitching. Pull my fabric back and cut the cording off even with the starting point. And then I usually fold this back so that it is also a bias line right there so it's not folding over on top of itself. Tuck the start place in and roll it over and then finish stitching.
A beautiful and smooth transition. Looks great. Up next, we'll be joining the boxing together and then sewing it to the top plate. In order to join the ends of the boxing together correctly, it's a good idea to check to make sure that they are exactly positioned in the right spot before we proceed.
Okay, here is my original pattern pieces that we cut these all from. And I've laid them on top of my pieces to make sure that I get everything in the right place and know the difference between top and bottom. This one isn't actually marked top and bottom, but I know that I added the 1/2 inch at the bottom. This one's marked top, so this is the side that gets sewn to my top plate. And the same thing on this one. It's not marked top and bottom, but I remember that I added the 1/2 inch at the bottom, so this edge right here gets sewn here. So I've got them in place where they need to be. So I can take the pattern pieces off and lay them on my top plate like this. And this is the piece that's going to show that we cut to match. So if I fold down my 1/2 inch seam, you can see that the pattern is going to be continuous from the top of the cushion to the boxing strip. So before I sew this onto the top plate, I'm going to sew this seam and this seam. And they go like this to make this corner. And you'll have a little bit of an ear on each end. And this will be sewn in a 1/2 inch seam also. And this one down here is the same thing. I want to sew this short seam together, and I'll end up with an ear on each end. This part right here is this big long strip, and I'm going to wait to do that so that I don't have to cut it exactly to size. I can sew it on and then trim it off after it's sewn on.
Cindy sews a 1/2 inch away from the ends of those boxing strips, reversing at the beginning and reversing at the end to lock the stitch in place.
Now at this point, you can use pins and put some pins in this. I would either pin it or seam stick it, because you want this corner to end up here, and you want this corner to end up here at this corner. So a few pins or some seam stick to stabilize it is a really good idea at this point. I'm going to use seam stick. I'm going to apply the seam stick to on top of the cording, as close to the edge as possible so that it doesn't fall within my seam line. You don't want this to show on the right side of the cushion.
Using seam stick 1/4 inch basting tape for canvas is a very helpful tool when it comes to sewing cushions with irregular sides like ours. It's also great for sewing cushions that have stripes when you want the boxing to match the plate.
Now I can press this piece onto my top plate. I'm going to mark up, make sure that this seam is right at the corner, and press it down, and this will hold it in place until I get to the machine. And since this piece was cut to match, I'm going to check and make sure that it is matched, and I can readjust it. If it isn't, you can pull this off the seam stick and readjust. And looks like it's pretty close right there. I also want this seam to be on this corner, so that's where I'm going to start pressing this down.
So now both corners are secured to the seam stick at the appropriate spots. If everything was cut out precisely and accurately, we should find that when the boxing strip between those two corners is pressed down to the seam stick, it should be just about perfect. If not, it can be manipulated slightly. We will show that later on in this video on another side. This side looks just about perfect. If it weren't, there are ways to stretch or shrink the fabric. We'll show that later on as discussed.
And on this side, I'm going to stop about 3 or 4 inches in from the end, because I'll need some room to add my other strip to this seam right here.
This irregular boxing piece will join up with the straight rectangular piece boxing. That's why she left this end unbasted, so it can be sewed together first. Now here on this piece, you'll notice that when she is basting the boxing to the plate, it is not perfect. In fact, there's a slight discrepancy in the length of the boxing compared to the plate. See, there's extra plate material underneath. That can be worked out. Watch what she does here. She will actually stretch the boxing only slightly, because if it's stretched too much, you'll see wrinkles in the final piece. So you need to do this very carefully. So you notice she's trying to distribute the stress or the stretch along the length of the boxing as she's basting it in place.
On this end, I forgot to stop back from the this corner where I'm going to need to seam on, but this peels up really easily, so I can peel it up and do that seam and then stick it back down. So I'm going to start stitching about 3 or 4 inches back from this edge, this corner, and stitch all the way around to the other side.
The reason a few inches were left unsewn is because we need to join the rectangular boxing to this at a later step, so we left a few inches unsewn at the beginning. Here we reach a corner and bury our needle at the corner. Something just fell off the table. Lift our presser foot, roll the assembly around, lower the presser foot, and continue to sew down the length. When sewing this assembly, since we sewed a piping onto the plate first, try to be sure this stitch is right next to the piping, so it is either on the first stitch that secured the piping or closer to the piping, so the first stitch that we used never shows up when the assembly is turned right side out. Here we're coming to the other side, and we will stop sewing a few inches short because we have to join the pipings together there.
This piece isn't cut to size, it's just cut across the width of the fabric, and I don't think one width is going to be enough. So I'm checking that. And there's a possibility that it might be, so I'm going to sew this seam up here, this short seam, and then sew all the way around the perimeter with, apply the seam stick again, till I get down to here and see if this is enough, and if it isn't, I'll add another little piece on, and if it is, then I can just stitch it to that seam. So first I'm going to stitch this 1/2 inch seam right here.
Cindy will use the seam stick 1/4 inch for canvas here along this edge as well to baste in place the rectangular shaped boxing along that edge. Here we're reaching another corner, and a slit will be made at that corner. Try not to make the slit any deeper than a 1/2 inch, otherwise it'll show up when the cover is turned right side out. Watch what she does when she comes to this inside turn. Using scissors, she'll make several slits at that turn in the boxing. Never go deeper than a 1/2 inch or your seam allowance. Now she'll straighten out the plate underneath and continue basting the boxing around that inside turn.
This little clip right here that I put in when I was at the machine putting the cording on is what lets that lay out straight to get your boxing in that little corner, that inside corner.
That's the slit that we made in the actual plate and the piping.
And it looks like this piece is going to be long enough, I won't have to add anything onto it. So before I stitch this seam right here, I'm going to trim this off at this edge right here, the edge of my top plate, and that will allow for a 1/2 inch seam there. So I'm going to go back to the machine and stitch this seam right here, and then I can stitch all the rest of the way around.
This stitch, joining the boxing ends together, is a 1/2 inch from the end of the boxing strips. And do some reversing at the beginning, and we'll do some reversing at the end. A slit will be made in the boxing right at the corner, which will help the boxing take the 90-degree turn here. Because we used seam stick basting tape, 1/4 inch for canvas, we can apply this boxing directly where we want it prior to sewing.
Okay, it's all basted down now. I'm going to go back up to where I stopped stitching up here and stitch the rest of the way around.
The process for sewing around the perimeter is done exactly as it has been shown before, so we will not highlight this. We've skipped ahead. Here it is with the piping, boxing, and the plate all sewn together. This cushion has an odd shape, and Cindy's going to explain that next.
Okay, I've turned the boxing around so that you can see that this takes kind of an odd shape before you put the back on it, because of the wedge that we cut in the foam to follow the lines of the boat. This kind of sucks in towards the bottom, and one of these seams right here, you can see that is not a smooth transition from one side to the other. So when I stitch the bottom plate onto this, I'll smooth that out. This little bit of fabric right here is not going to cause any problems in the way your cushion fits.
Before we can install the bottom plate, we need to first install a zipper since it was not added to the boxing.
Our next step on this cushion is to put the zipper in the bottom plate, and I've marked this with the wrong side. I want to put the zipper on the wrong side, and I want to make it across the widest part of the cushion so that we can have enough room to stuff the cushion in there, and I want to make the zipper as long as I possibly can to make it easier to get the cushion in there. So I'm going to use the seam stick on this again. I'm going to apply it to the zipper tape all the way down.
Be sure not to apply the basting tape too close to the teeth.
Apply it to both sides of the zipper tape, and then we'll apply the zipper to the cushion underlining.
This cushion underlining material, as you can see from a close-up here, has little tiny holes that allows breathability. It's also vinyl, so it kind of sticks to the surfaces it sat on. It is also very inexpensive and does not unravel when cut with scissors, so it's a great option for cushions that cannot be flipped.
When I stitch the zipper on, I'm going to use this edge of the foot right up against the zipper teeth on this side. And I want to start about an inch or so away from the end of the zipper. It'll be a little easier to get my zipper pull on if I leave a little bit of extra there.
Notice that reversing is done at the beginning and here at the end to lock the stitch in place.
And then just turn it around and go down the other side using the same side of the zipper foot up against the zipper teeth.
By sewing on the same side of the presser foot as the previous stitch, we're assured that the stitch is exactly the same distance from the teeth of the zipper. Don't forget to add the slider before sewing the end shut. To install the slider, push the skinny end onto the zipper, pull the zipper's teeth apart till you hear a pop, and then push the slider in place. Be sure that the slider puller is facing the fabric.
Now that the zipper's open, I can take and cut a slit in the center of my cushion underlining so that I can open my cushion.
Next, we're going to create a zipper stop out of the scrap fabric.
And I'm going to cut 2 small pieces of fabric, and this will be my zipper stop at the top and at the bottom. So I'm going to lay it on there folded and stitch over it 2 or 3 times.
If you do not have a heavy-duty sewing machine like the Sayrite Ultrafeed, do this carefully, because if the needle hits the teeth, you may break the needle or throw your machine out of time.
And I'll do that on both ends. And I can slit the fabric the rest of the way in between the 2 stitching lines.
Our zipper's installed. The cushion underlining edges will not unravel. You could also use Pfeiffertex for a cushion underlining material as well. Coming up next, we'll sew the assembly to the bottom plate.
The last step on this cushion is to sew the bottom plate to the boxing and the top plate, and I'm going to use the seam stick again on this and apply it to the right side of the bottom plate. out at the edge. And I'm going to use it all the way around the perimeter.
We'll now take that bottom plate after the basting tape has been applied all around and place it on top of our assembly so outside surfaces are facing each other. Notice the zipper is up. We'll remove the basting tape on one side and start to adhere the bottom plate, matching up the corners as we did when we attached the boxing to the top plate. Basting the bottom plate to the assembly is a good idea because we're assured that it fits perfectly before we sew.
At this corner right here, I want this corner to match this corner, so I'm going to use the cording and line it up back here so that it feels like it's together. Pull my fabric out straight and clip this, and that will tell me where this corner needs to end up.
So she has clipped where the corner should fall on the boxing. Make sure you don't clip deeper than the seam allowance. For us, that's a 1/2 inch. Remember earlier on in this video we talked about the shortcut that Cindy made by adding the 1/2 inch to the boxing to one side rather than splitting it to both long sides of the boxing. In other words, a 1/4 inch and a 1/4 inch along both long edges. Well, here is where you may see that negative consequence play out, in that the bottom plate may not match up perfectly with the perimeter of the boxing.
And I'm going to do the same clip here that I did on the top plate to open this up so that it lays out straight. And you can get that inside corner where it needs to be.
This is the inside turn. Take note, we did not cut the boxing with a hot knife, and as you can see here, there is some unraveling that is taking place. Not a big deal because most of that will be on the inside of the cushion, but we just want you to know this is what happens when you don't use a hot knife with a synthetic fabric. We've ran into a slight issue here. Let's let Cindy explain.
You can see from this area to this corner, I've got a little bit of extra of the bottom plate, so I've basted it with a seam stick, but that allows me to pull it up and rebaste it. And these cushions are not an exact science, so I'm going to move most of that extra down here to the bottom.
This issue is not uncommon, but not splitting the 1/2 inch and adding it to both sides of the irregular boxing may be the main culprit. Let's go back to the patterning of the irregular boxing and listen to what Cindy said about that.
Okay, we want to add a little bit of seam allowance to all of these pieces, and technically we should add 1/4 inch to each side of this, top and bottom, but it's not really going to make that much difference in the end product, so I'm going to add the 1/2 inch to the bottom of all of these pieces.
So what she did here was a shortcut, and the consequences are minimal. However, an oddly shaped object does change its overall size if allowances are only added to one side instead of two.
So I'm going to go back to this top corner and work around this way and see where things end up on my corners going this way before I baste that bottom area down there.
So because we were off on that one side, she's going to move to the other side and baste around going the opposite direction to see if it's off on this side as well, or if this helps to correct it.
And this is the area that I talked about before that I was going to avoid that little angle.
To avoid it, there's extra boxing there, so she'll base the bottom plate on so the excess boxing is just sticking out there. So the bottom plate will match the adjoining boxing that is a little bit skinnier. That's how you deal with it. Cindy is working her way along this edge to the location that is in question. She is not making adjustments to the bottom plate or boxing at this time. in other words, stretching or shrinking one more than the other. But she may have to do that if it does not match up well. Bottom plate corners should be matched up so that the corner extends about a 1/2 inch, our seam allowance, from the seam that secured our boxing together. That's the correct location. This edge and corner matched up well, so we're good here. So let's go back to our problem area and discuss that more.
Now when I pull this down and put this corner here where it should be on the corner of my bottom plate and this corner where it should be, I end up with a little bit of extra on the bottom plate. So what I'm going to do to solve that is pull the basting up and ease it in a little bit all the way down this edge of the seam. And that means just putting a little bit of fullness every few inches, and the machine will take that up when you stitch it. I'm going to open it up all the way to this corner so I have plenty of room to ease in that little bit of extra.
Easing in the fabric here does have a few consequences. If done excessively, you will see more wrinkles in the finished cushion. Since we're doing this to the bottom plate, they should only be visible on the bottom side of our cushion for us. So do not do this too much and try to distribute it along as long of an area as possible to reduce the possible wrinkles.
Now these little areas right here, when the machine stitches it, it will pull that. I'm going to stitch with this on the top, and the machine will naturally pull these out so it'll lay nice and flat when we're finished.
What she's saying is typically true. However, the fabricator, you, will still see very small wrinkles when the cushion is done. It is likely that no one else will, but only you. Easing of fabric is very common when making cushions, especially custom irregular cushions. And the more you try to distribute the easing along a long length, the fewer and smaller the wrinkles will be. Now, let's see if this side matches up as well.
And the same thing is happening on this side, so I'll just move it around, and then when it's stitched it'll still lay flat.
Only slight easing had to be done here, so it's very minimal. Now before we go and show you how to sew this up, let's show you what the finished piece looks like on the bottom side.
From here around to here is where we had to ease the cushion underlining into the boxing, and you can see there's a little bit of a fullness right here, but this is the bottom side of the cushion and that's not going to cause any issues.
Now that everything is sewn in place, we'll take it to the sewing machine. The bottom plate is facing down, and we'll sew a 1/2 inch around the entire perimeter of the cushion. At each corner, we'll bury the needle at the corner, lift the foot, position the fabric, lower the foot, and continue to sew. Just like we did with the rest of the assembly earlier. Here, there is no piping. Because everything was basted in place with seam stick 1/4 inch basting tape for canvas, we do not have to worry about positioning the bottom plate and the boxing as we sew around its perimeter. Because the seam stick or basting tape is only a 1/4 inch wide and our stitch is a 1/2 inch from the raw edge, that double-sided tape will never be visible when our cushion is turned right side out because it's inside of the seam allowance. You would not want that seam stick to show up when the cushion is turned right side out. Otherwise, dirt and other particles may collect on it and it may become unsightly.
I just want to show you the difference between using the hot knife on this fabric and not using the hot knife. This is the hot knife edge right here where we cut the top plate with the hot knife. I did not cut the boxing with the hot knife, and you can see all of the ravels when you're working with it. That's just from working with it.
Our cushion cover is complete. Now all we need to do is insert the foam. Unzip the zipper all the way, and then turn the assembly right side out. It will be necessary to insert your hand inside of the cover and push the corners out. This job is always much easier with two people, so I'm going to help Cindy do this and leave the camera on a tripod. To insert foam into a cushion cover is a lot like wrestling an alligator. You could use silk film and a vacuum cleaner and suck the foam down slightly and then insert it in the cover. That makes the job easy.
That's what you need to do is shove that corner in.
However, because we're using a dry fast foam, we would not want to leave the silk film in place because that obviously defeats the purpose of a dry fast
Yeah,
foam.
once you get it in there, it's just adjusting.
As Cindy stated, once the foam is inside the cover, you'll need to stick your hands inside and make adjustments to fit the foam into each of the corners, wedges, and so that the piping and the bottom plate sit exactly as they should along the edges of the foam.
So the seam down there needs to be pushed over also.
I'm in conquering mode. Position the fabric until you're happy. As we start to zip the zipper shut, you'll see a few wrinkles appear. That's because the zipper is not shut all the way and the foam is not in the exact perfect position. We're still positioning the cover. Once the zipper is shut all the way, we can still do some maneuvering of the fabric to get most of those wrinkles out. The only wrinkles that you'll see are the ones that we use to ease the bottom plate in place, but they're on the bottom side. The top side and all of the boxing is gorgeous. Let's take a close-up look. As you can see, there are no wrinkles, and the boxing and the piping are exactly where we want them along the edge of the cushion. It's a very nice tight fit, and that will reduce the amount of wrinkles that typically take place after a cushion is used over several years. Now let's flip it over and show you the bottom side as well, because on the bottom side there are those few wrinkles we talked about earlier. But again, no one's going to flip the cushion over to inspect it. Another great looking cushion. Thanks, Cindy. Now let's go over the materials lists and the tools that we used. You will find all kinds of great upholstery fabrics at Saorite for cushions like this. A variety of foams are also available, including the dry fast foam used here or high density polyurethane foam. If you have questions about the types of foam to use for your application, give us a call. This type of project can typically be sewn with any heavy-duty home sewing machine, but as always, if you want the world's best portable walking foot sewing machine, check out the Saorite Ultrafeeds at www.saorite.com. Coming soon, we will complete more videos covering the construction of a few more of the cushions for this forward berth area. Check them out at Saorite.com or our YouTube channel. It's your loyal patronage to Saorite that makes these free videos available. Thanks for your loyal support. I'm Eric Grant, and from all of us here at Saorite, thanks for watching.